had invaded her heart. So instead, she suppressed those feelings. She came down those stairs, and with unfeigned enthusiasm, she participated in this family ritual. What do we see here in this very simple scene? We see the invasion of grace. Therese realized now that her life had to be completely determined by the love of Jesus. In the wake of this event, the desire to become a Carmelite, which had been in her since childhood, now became a burning preoccupation. After she convinced her father that this was right for her, she met with extraordinary courage a number of bishops and ecclesiastics who opposed her and told her that she was too young. But she resolved to bring the case to the highest possible court. She joined a group of pilgrims going to Rome, hoping to present her plea personally to Pope Leo XIII himself. On November 20th, 1887, Therese had her audience. Though she had been told to say nothing to the Pope, she blurted out, "Holy Father, in honor of your Jubilee, permit me to enter Carmel at the age of 15. The Pope smiled and told her to do what her superiors ordered. But she persisted, "Oh, Holy Father, if you say yes, everyone will agree." The Pope responded, "Go, go. You will enter if God wills it." At that point, still begging and weeping, she was carried off bodily by two papal guards. A month later, the Bishop of Bayeux relented, and she was given permission to enter Carmel. For the next 9 years, until her death at 24, Therese never left the confines of the Lisieux Carmel, living the simple life of a Carmelite religious. But in the course of those years, she began to cultivate a spiritual path that she came to call the Little Way. It was not the path of her great Carmelite forebears, Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, not the way of spiritual athletes, but a way that any simple believer could follow. It had a great deal to do with spiritual childhood, becoming a little child in the presence of God the Father, dependent, hopeful, waiting to receive gifts. She wrote this in The Story of a Soul: "Jesus deigned to show me the road that leads to this divine furnace. And this road is the surrender of the little child who sleeps without fear in his father's arms." It involved, too, a willingness to do simple and ordinary things out of great love. Little acts of kindness, small sacrifices accepted graciously. One of the most memorable passages in The Story of the Soul is Therese's delicious description of her very patient dealings with a cranky old nun to whom she'd been assigned. At the heart of the Little Way is the prudence to know in any given situation what is the demand of love, willing the good of the other as other. Toward the end of her life, Therese experienced the intense desire to do all the things the great figures in the history of the church had done. She said, "I wanted to be priest, martyr, missionary, evangelist, and doctor." Then she thought, how could I possibly be any of these things in my little monastery here in Cap Med? Then she read Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, and she was struck by that magnificent passage where Paul talks about the more excellent way, the way of love. Therese realized in a flash that love was the form of all the virtues. Love was what made the lives of all the saints possible. Love was what undergirded the work of priest, missionary, evangelist, doctor. And so she said, "Jesus, my love, I found my vocation. I will be love in the heart of the church." That is the little way. I mentioned at the outset how I, like many others, was initially put off by the overly emotional, sentimental style of The Little Flower. But even the most skeptical reader is usually won over by the account of her terrible struggle at the end of her life with unbelief. What began to plague Therese were doubts about the very existence of heaven. Like Hamlet, she began to wonder whether anything followed this sleep of death. And this was no passing bout of intellectual scrupulosity. It would last up until the very end of her life. She wrote, "This trial was to last not a matter of days or weeks. It would not be extinguished until the hour set by God himself. And that hour has not yet come." She wrote that just a few weeks before she died. What's extraordinary is how she interpreted this struggle as a participation in the pain of so many of her contemporaries who no longer believe in God. She wrote, "During the joyful days of Easter, Jesus made me really feel there are souls who have no faith. He allowed my soul to be invaded by the thickest darkness." Therese died of tuberculosis on September the 30th, 1897. As I mentioned at the outset, at the time of her death, she was known only by a handful of people. Yet, within a few years of her passing, through the influence of the story of a soul, the little way began to beguile people all over the world. I spoke of Catherine Drexel's sanctity as a sort of elevated justice. I characterized Therese's holiness as transfigured prudence. Prudence is a kind of moral know-how. The little way is prudence elevated and transfigured by the radicality of Christ's love. She had a great poetic imagination. That's what grabs people too. She always protested that she was not one of these spiritual athletes. She knew about John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, these great figures. She admired them. And she would say, but I'm not like that. I'm not a spiritual athlete. I'm not one of these great trees that grow up to God. I'm just a little flower. That's where the nickname comes from. I'm a little flower on the floor of the forest. No one's going to notice me. But the sun can shine equally on all of them. The sun hits the high trees and the sun comes down to the forest floor. And so it's a great metaphor for the universality of grace. That we're all susceptible to the influence of grace. As the sun shines on the good and the bad alike, it shines on the great and the small alike. So that was a great bit of spiritual intuition she had, I think, that appeals to people.
What about that analogy of, like, you said she lifted her hand looking up?
Oh yeah, that's a splendid one, I think. It's beautiful, and there's kind of a wry smile behind it, because she again acknowledges the spiritual athletes, the really serious people. They're climbing their way up to God, and she admired them. But she also, with that little wry smile, would say, well, I'm just this little child, and I can't climb the mountain, but I can raise my arms up like this, and of course, he's going to want to pick me up. And then she sort of winks at the spiritual athletes and says, and actually, I get higher than you, because he lifts me right up. It's that kind of perception that I think people find very moving and very attractive.
So, that's my presentation on saints. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about Saint Therese. There was one more slide. I'm going to encourage all of you to start thinking now about who you want to have as your patron saint. Maybe Saint Therese inspired some of you. But there's a great link here. You can also go out and do a search, how do I choose a saint? A bunch of stuff's going to be there for 12, 13, 14-year-old kids trying to decide who they want to have as their patron saint, which I found very touching and very moving. So you might enjoy that. But this one gives a list of saints and what they are a patron saint of and what their liturgical date for their feast day. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and thank y'all very much. And turn it back to Richard. And just remember, we're going to have our breakout about what Father Mike Schmidt talked about on how all of us can be saints.